So I'm John Kane, and I welcome you to Let's Talk Native on this Saturday, January 25th. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage and in some cases start conversations. We kind of break the rules around here as far as Native radio goes. We don't do prayers and we don't do buffalo speeches. We take a tough look at history, oppression, and survival. We talk about culture, the arts, politics, and identity. And we may step on a few toes along the way, but our real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We'll take on the false narratives and provide critical thinking to all that's heaped upon us, and we do it all right here live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. So let's talk Native. But first, let me remind people you can listen to the show on our web page, on our website, which is letstalknative.com. We live stream video of the show on Facebook, on our Facebook group pages, and that's shared on a bunch of pages. We take the audio, we put it up on SoundCloud, which puts it out as a podcast on all your favorite podcast platforms, including, which is kind of recent, Spotify. So if Spotify is your podcast format or location of choice, then you can find us there, and all of our shows up there. We weren't all the shows weren't on there originally, but they all are now, so you can catch them all. I encourage you to go ahead and subscribe to our podcast. Now, I also encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We take the videos of the show and we put it up on YouTube, and you can catch this show, my show in New York, and our short form videos on our YouTube channel. So subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. All right. I am the show's host and producer, and I'm joined in studio by Jake Proud, who manages the audio and the video, and much more, does all the technical stuff. So again, welcome to Let's Talk Native. All right. So I want to talk about some history, and I've talked about some of this stuff before, but I want to bring it into the context of the fact that history is so whitewashed. It's buried, as I say. It is lied about. It's misrepresented. And I'm going to give a couple of examples, but one of the things that kind of, encourages me to have this conversation now and is some of the pop culture stuff. Not the least of which is the Super Bowl. Now, I know people think, well, you're going to talk about mascots, and yeah, I am, but not what you think. Yeah, the Kansas City team does have a native mascot, and it's wrong. It's a misappropriation of culture. It's bastardizing everything from our image to even words. I mean, the word chief is not even one of our words. I mean, I think it's more tied to Scotland than anything else. I don't even know where the word comes from, but it has been placed upon us. And so, this whole idea of chiefs and chieftainship and all that other stuff, probably more people associate it with Native people than they do wherever the origin of the word is. But no, I'm not going to talk about the Kansas City team. Even though I could go on and on about the wrongness of the appropriation of our images, the whole tomahawk chop stuff, all of that crazy stuff. I could talk about that, but I'm not. It's their opponents, because it's almost like nobody even thinks about what is a 49er. Anybody? Hands? Anybody? Anybody know what a 49er is? These are the guys who are associated with the gold rush of California. Now, if you look at that history, and depending on who you talk to, even the governor of California talks fondly about what a great part of California history was, that the gold rush was. Well, no, it wasn't. It was essentially California's reason for genocide. I mean, one of the biggest parts of the American Holocaust is what took place in California. I mean, I know people think about the Lakota War, the Indian Wars, and all that other stuff, but in California, it was just genocide. It was just mass slaughter. The state of California, well, actually, I don't even know if it was a state yet, but coming out of not only the 1849 when gold is discovered on John Sutter's ranch, which had enslaved Native people working there, by the way. coming out of that, there ends up being this real push for the United States to take their manifest destiny, like it's some sort of God's calling. No, it was gold's calling, and go in there and not only strip that part of the continent away from another false claim, Mexico or Spain's claim to the land, and then go on a wholesale slaughter of native people. I mean, there was probably 500,000 or better native people who lived in what is known now as California before the Spanish got there, and that number got wiped out, down to probably closer to 100,000 or 150,000. But over 500,000 down, and they would lose that population at the hands of the Spanish, in Mexico. But once the gold rush happened, that population would be dropped down to close to 10,000 people. So during the Spanish period, we're talking about a longer period of time, but only over the last less than a decade, a population of 100 or 150,000 native people will be wiped out, down to about 10,000, 15,000 people. I mean, it's insane to think about how much slaughter took place. And keep in mind, this is the 1849 to 1851, 1857, that era. This is before L. Frank Baum calling for our extermination. The governors, the military, look, they were actually taxing the gold revenue, or taking revenue from the gold to fund to the to the tune of $1 million a year, fund these private militias to kill native people, just to wipe native people out. The last posting, if you look up redskins or bounties for scalps, you usually find two public proclamations. One from King George in like the 1750s, and then one 100 years later from California. Literally calling for some of these guys who sucked at panning for gold and finding gold, they found ways to make money by killing Indians and turning in scalps. No, so that part of the history. Now, look, I know what you're saying. Oh, you're just taking advantage of the fact that a team is playing in the sport. Well, look, it brings it to my mind, but I think some truth has to be told about some of that history. I got to point out, I'm wearing my Get Over It t-shirt today because that's what this is all about. We get told to get over this bad part of the history. Well, how do you get over it if you're going to lie about it? If it's going to be a constant lie about our history, about the history of the United States. I mean, and to be clear, this idea of manifest destiny, it didn't stop at the Pacific Ocean. No, I mean, they would do the same thing to Hawaii. They would do the same thing to the Philippines. They would do the same thing to other places in the world. This insatiable appetite, because, here's what it comes down to. And it's funny because we live in a time now where everybody's concerned about an economic fallout. The solution for countries like the United States was just take more land. Take it from Spain, take it from Mexico. I mean, I was really surprised the United States says it didn't invade Canada on a more regular basis. Although that border had to be worked out, obviously, between the two colonial empires, right, British and American. But I mean, this idea that the United States and they try to like mask it like somehow, they didn't just call it manifest destiny. You know what else they called it? White man's burden. Yeah. That's the other expression that is used for manifest destiny, white man's burden. Because they felt it was white man's obligation to expand in the name of Christendom, in the name of spreading their religious beliefs, which most of that was bullshit too. Because you had on one hand, you had the same guys who called themselves preachers, like General Shivington, who was a preacher. I'm a holy man who talked about murder. and just murdering, savages. And actually, he called it, if you didn't sign up for murdering savages, he thought that you also should go to hell. I mean, this is the attitude that existed, and it existed not just from Columbus's first steps, and realizing what could be done with these native people, but all the way through all the way through U.S. history. And then you lie about it and you cover it up. I think it's important that people know what a 49er is and what took place as a result of the gold rush. When I hear Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, speak in light and airy tones about how this put California on the map. Yeah, put you on the map, all right. Put you on the genocide map. I mean, because this is one of the major portions of that American Holocaust, the California genocide. And it is directly tied to the 49ers, to these guys, because it was tens of thousands of white men who just believed that they could just go to California, kill Indians, and get rich by finding gold. They thought there was this unlimited supply of gold that every man could grab. And of course, most people don't even know what the hell a 49er is. And yet it's used as a mascot for a $1 billion sports franchise. So, I mean, look, I know when I talk about mascots, everybody expects me to talk about the Washington football team or the Atlanta baseball team or perhaps the Kansas City football team. And the crazy part is when we say it's inappropriate to use a people for a mascot, somebody will throw something out there like, oh, yeah, well, what about Vikings or Cowboys or 49ers? Well, let's talk about 49ers. Sure, I'm willing to talk about 49ers and the inappropriateness of because trust me, none of those people playing football in San Francisco represent those 49ers. And if they did, they should be ashamed of it. But let me not stop. Let's not just stop right there, because there are a lot of other issues about how history is dealt with. And I'll give you an example. A few years ago, my grandson had to do some worksheet on the Grand Canyon. Out of his textbook, it literally said that the first man to explore the Grand Canyon was John Wesley Powell, a white man. Now, I'll admit that if you go to Wikipedia right now and you look up the history of the Grand Canyon, it'll list it'll list a bunch of the other territories, the Havasupa, the Hualapai, the Puebloan peoples, the Anasazi. I mean, it'll list all kinds of other native people who clearly, because there's pictographs, there's all kinds of things that show that native people were there long before, thousands of years. An ongoing tradition of native people being tied to the Grand Canyon for thousands of years before John Wesley Powell. But why would Wikipedia have that? Because somebody probably realized just how badly it was being represented. But the problem is the history books, the ones that they're still using for our kids in schools today, they're not current. They don't have the public being able to edit accurately, or sometimes not so accurately, like Wikipedia does. And I'm not saying that Wikipedia should be the only place that people look, but I looked, and I was almost pleasantly surprised to see how many native peoples they listed in association with the Grand Canyon. I mean, the Paiute, I mean, down south, the southern part of the Grand Canyon. I mean, all of it. I mean, it lists a whole bunch. That's Wikipedia, but not the history books. So our kids in the 5th and 6th grade or whatever else, they're getting hit with this stuff, or the 4th grade. I don't even know what grade he was in when we first confronted this. But see, this is part of the problem. Now, you can say, the kids aren't going to retain the history anyway. But that's what they're being indoctrinated. They have to write this stuff down. He literally had to list John Wesley Powell because that's the answer they wanted. If he'd have put any other answer, depending on who the teacher was, I mean, if he'd have said Native people had been exploring that Grand Canyon for tens of thousands of years before John Wesley Powell. Depending on the liberal viewpoint that teacher might have had, he might have just got that wrong. I had to tell him the answer he's putting down was wrong, even though I didn't tell him not to. But I didn't look. I can't tell people to confront in the same way that I would. I could, but if he decided not to put John Wesley Powell down, I would have been okay with it. But I wasn't going to tell him what answer to put down. I just said, well, let me tell you some real history. And look, and this isn't. And the sad part is that's not my history. That's not my people in that area. But when white men are going to write these history books and they're going to put this stuff down, it should be on them to find some of the truth of that history. I'll give you another example. Jeopardy. Jeopardy is one of these shows you can watch and you can learn a lot of stuff, right? They give all kinds of, sometimes useless information, some information that is kind of intriguing. One of the questions on Jeopardy had to do with these people were the first to settle the area that would come to be known as Las Vegas. And the answer, according to Jeopardy, was the Mormons. What do you mean the freaking Mormons? There had been native people living in that area that would be called Las Vegas for tens of thousands of years before the Mormons would be there. The Paiutes, the Anasazi, there were all, and there's evidence all around that area, historical evidence that proves that and again, if you look it up on Wikipedia, it'll list some of that stuff. But I guarantee, if you the history books and Jeopardy, the guy who gets all the data for Jeopardy, no, it's the Mormons. The Mormons. So. And that's pop culture, folks. I mean, even if you can dismiss, if you're a fan of James Lowen and Lies My Teacher Told Me, and even if you can dismiss the history books, this is the kind of pop culture stuff and I hear stuff all the time. You watch a movie and you'll hear some reference about the gold rush. You'll hear some reference about, again, the Mormons in an area or whatever else, with complete disregard for some of the true history. And that's a problem, folks. Because, it isn't just about ancient history. And again, I've talked about this before. But it has been fairly well documented that there's almost no mention of native people past the turn of the century. You enter into the 20th century, after the year 1900, we are almost we're not even mentioned. And prior to that, everything's misrepresented. Look, that's why we have this whole thing, the myth of Columbus. Look, when you're going to tell me that some white man discovered the land that we already lived on, and most of that's not even true because Columbus didn't actually come to the mainland. So even to say he's the first white man to do it, no, that's not the way they say it. No, 1492, Columbus discovered America and discovered us. Like we needed to be uncovered somehow. Look, the same thing happens, and we can get into conversations about what they call federal recognition. This whole notion that unless the federal government somehow grants their recognition, and look, I just heard a story on NPR today. Some I don't even remember what tribe it is because they get these names that are reimagined, I guess. I don't know what the name of the band was that just got federally recognized in Montana. And the guy says, the problem is, it's like our own people. We always knew who we were. But other native peoples say, oh, but you're not federally recognized. Well, I'll tell you, the problem with that is that we put too much of an emphasis on what is federally recognized and what is not. Little Shell? Yeah. They just, I think, and you know how they got federally recognized? It was written into the The National Defense Authorization Act. Yeah, that's where they put it in there. Oh yeah, we're going to throw all this other stuff into it. That's why they call these things omnibus bills, because I said bulls. They should call it bulls, yeah, because it's bullshit. So they throw this in there. But I mean, so we can exist for thousands and thousands of years, obviously pre-exist America, or the concept of America. And then when they said federal recognition not means now that the federal government recognized them as a sovereign nation. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. What it means is they're now federally recognized as a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States. There's nothing, and they came up with this definition in 1934. Of course, that's after 1900, so nobody's going to mention that, right? They came up with this definition to try to further subjugate Native people. There's no mention of the word sovereignty in there. I mean, and then when people use the word sovereignty, they always say tribal sovereignty. So again, one of these words that they put a precursor in front of it. So it doesn't really mean sovereignty. It means something else. And the United States went through great pains, especially during this development of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, to say, look, we have a problem with coming up with a UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because we don't want to rewrite international law, and we sure as hell don't want to rewrite ours. And so what they said is, we don't really recognize sovereignty, or that Native people have the right to assert sovereignty over their lands. We recognize, and even self-determination, we have a problem with that word, because we mean internal self-determination. So when we say the words self-determination or self-governance, we mean it within our definition of self-determination and self-governance, which means internal. We are not going to recognize them as some sort of nation state. We aren't really going to recognize them as sovereign. And this is the battle that's going on in Hawaii right now. You've got a 500,000 people who have become woke about the illegal occupation of Hawaii and the fact that the Hawaiian kingdom was completely undermined by the United States through a military coup, and are not prepared to concede that. They say, no, our lands are illegally occupied. And this goes even beyond the statehood or the false claim that the Hawaii was somehow legally annexed. It wasn't. There's no annexation treaty between the Kingdom of Hawaii and the United States. In fact, even the bullshit Hawaiian Republic, that was a bunch of white men who decided, no, we're going to represent ourselves as the nation of Hawaii now, not as the Kingdom of Hawaii, but as the Hawaiian Republic. There's not even a legitimate annexation treaty between them, because for one thing, that was all fraud. And if you don't believe me, you can read in the Joint Resolution of Congress where they acknowledge, and this is from 1993, the Joint Resolution of Congress, where they call it the Apology Resolution, because the United States apologizes for what they did to Hawaii. They don't rectify it. They don't take any actions to reconcile what they did. But they say they apologize. And here's the crazy thing about an apology resolution: when some of the Hawaiian activists said, "Well, we're going to use that resolution. Then we're going to cite that in some of our land use issues." The Supreme Court says, "Well, that Joint Resolution of Congress thing, it doesn't really have any legal merit. You can't use that in a legal proceeding. It's just fluff. It doesn't really mean anything." Now, here's the problem with this. The whole means for which the United States claims to have annexed Hawaii was through a joint resolution of Congress. It wasn't through the normal process of a treaty being negotiated between two parties, or one asking or requesting to be annexed, and then going through a Senate confirmation, which would have required two-thirds majority of the Senate to confirm the annexation of this land. No, none of that happened. They did a simple majority through a joint resolution of Congress, which Today, the Supreme Court will say, yeah, those joint resolutions of Congress, they don't really mean anything. They're just kind of PR. It's the kind of stuff we put out there. Yeah, we say we're sorry, but we're not gonna make any amends for it. There's no contrition. We just say it so everybody can feel good about it. That's the history, folks. That's some of that history. All right, we're pretty much at the bottom of the hour, so here's what we'll take a break and we'll come back. And I want to nail some more of this stuff down, because this isn't about being hateful. This isn't about trying to pick a wound. It's about saying, look, let's be honest about some of this history. That's all we need to do. All right, this is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. We'll be right back. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. I want to thank our sponsors. Let's Talk Native is sponsored by Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, and the folks at Grand River Enterprises and Native Wholesale Supply. I want to thank you guys in particular for your consistent support and just being able to rely on you to fund what we do here. And look, there's a lot of hidden costs. I mean, there's services that we have to pay for to do this. And of course, I also travel to New York each week, and so these guys enable that. And there are others of you who on occasion will throw a check in the mail or perhaps even do a PayPal thing, make a donation through PayPal. That's another way to support. A further way to support is, as you saw during the break, we listed up our store. We not only sell some merchandise that promotes Let's Talk Native, but Jake took some time and put together some pretty provocative T-shirts. So if you want to wear a T-shirt that might make a few people cringe, and I know some of you do, then by all means check out what we've got on our store. You can find our store page on our website. So you go to letstalknative.com and just link to the store. And what we've done is we are utilizing Teespring as our printer for these for the Let's Talk Native shirts and for some of these again, some of these more cringeworthy pieces that we put together to make a bold statement. Now, we also provided a 10% discount. So I do have a special code. Now, I know it's going to be hard to remember. It's Kane. Yeah, that's my name. Yeah, Kane. Put Kane into the, there's a box that you enter a code when you go to actually order these things, and you can get a 10% discount. But this is a way that you can make a statement with your clothing and also support what we're doing here. So I encourage folks to do that as well. Look, I also want to thank those of you who share the show. And we, like as I mentioned in the intro, we are now on Spotify, which is one of the major podcast platforms. But we're on all of them: Stitcher, iTunes. You can find us on on all of them. TuneIn. And I encourage you to subscribe. Whatever platform you use, that's up to you, but you can find us on there. In fact, and if you don't know how to find us, you can just go to, you can ask Alexa. You can say, Alexa, play Let's Talk Native with John Kane podcast. And it'll pull up. I don't know what they probably give you one specific platform, but you can search for whatever you want. You can put that into a search bar. You can Google search it, and you'll get a variety of platforms. So we're easy enough to find. And on those podcasts, you'll have not only this show, Let's Talk Native, but you'll also get the Let's Talk show, the show that I do in New York. And now those are 2-hour audios, but they also have some pretty engaging callers, because we get some pretty good callers. Some are more provocative, some of them are antagonistic, but I like those too. I some of these guys who call in with a little bit of perhaps a racist view or a contrarian view, those guys are fun to talk to too. So, and again, that's. I put all this stuff out there so people are aware. Look, we are not a viral sensation by any means, and we're growing, and we get we're getting closer to 600 subscribers on our YouTube channel, and each week we get a few more listeners here and there, but we have not become a viral sensation by any means. And you guys can make the difference but with what you share. And look, those of you who listen each week, look, I really appreciate you. But those of you who listen and share the show, you guys are going to help expand the conversations. And really, this show is about education. It's about conversations that I hope that you're going to have. Not just listening to me, but you're going to, perhaps I strike a chord with you. Perhaps I say something that is going to, maybe you're going to look up Las Vegas now. Maybe you're going to look up Grand Canyon, and you're going to find out a little bit more about who actually lived there. Maybe you're going to find out about some of this history. I mean, you're going to look up California Gold Rush and or the California Genocide. Man, there's a bunch of stuff there. I mean, and I encourage you to look it up. We should all know that history, because we're still living with the legacy of that history. So when people tell me to get over it, and I wear this shirt as a sarcastic statement. I mean, in order to get over something, you have to address it. You can't just bury it. You can't pretend it didn't happen, and you can't lie about it, because lying about some of this history is worse, and misrepresenting it. Well, every time I hear and see another post about what a white man did on our lands, and what the great founding fathers did, and they ignore some of the racist parts of their history, I'm sorry, that's just tough to take. That's just tough to take. But I think part of this, learning some of this history, is because it puts it into context how we get to where we are today. Now, I understand, people are going to say, well, as long as you're going to keep painting yourself as victims. Look, much of what I talk about here in terms of history isn't just history. It's contemporary. We're still experiencing some of this stuff. I mean, I've talked about the battles that we have with New York State over them, the Senecas, for instance, having to battle the state. They're trying to take another $1 billion from the Senecas. I mean, and this is taking money. This isn't money that is owed, in spite of what you've been told. I mean, Oklahoma, you've got a governor in Oklahoma who is trying to squeeze them the same way this Democrat in the governor's mansion in Albany is trying to squeeze the Senecas. The governor in Oklahoma is trying to squeeze all of them, and there's a lot more native territories with gaming operations, and he's trying to squeeze them all. He wants a bigger piece of their action, and he's not giving them anything. Just like this governor's not giving anything. I know, yeah, exclusivity, yeah, my ass. Come on, that's all bullshit. And everybody knows it. So this is some of what we're going through today. We're going through, the problems we see with missing and murdered Indigenous women. And look, I'm not saying every missing woman has been murdered. Many of them have been. But many of the missing women in our territories are missing because the policies of the United States today have created almost unlivable conditions for Native people, with no hope or prospects for the future, no ability. Honestly, in many Native territories, the only way you can measure any types of success is leaving. And so that ends up being the path that's promoted. Oh, you got to get out of here. These are the rural ghettos, right? These are the native ghettos. That's the way our territories are looked at. I mean, and so that's the way we're looked at as a people, like we're lesser than everybody else. So what do you do with the best and brightest in every one of your territories? You encourage them to get the hell out of here. Oh, you don't want to have to. I mean, the only thing to do here is you can work for the nation. I mean, that's even true with the Seneca Nation. Some of the most successful opportunities. In fact, if you go to most native territories, the difference between the haves and the have-nots are those who work for the tribe and those who don't. I mean, here in Seneca Nation, there's a little bit more of a successful private sector or affluent private sector. So again, if you look here, the difference between the haves and have-nots are the ones with gas stations and smoke shops and the ones who work for the nation. And I don't mean just work for the nation. This includes the ones who get elected, because trust me, they've got a good gig. they get paid $100,000, and that might be the most money they'll ever see because they're not qualified for much else. They could earn that. And look, and I say that because it gets tied just to measuring people's net worth with dollars and cents. But getting back to the problems that exist in our territory. So unless you can be on the right side of the politics in any native territory, you're probably going to find yourself living in abject poverty with very, very, very little to look forward to in the future. So this impacts men and women. And so when we hear these stories of these missing and murdered Indigenous women and men, we know that more often than not, it is tied to a behavior or maybe even a lifestyle that people will say, oh, that's not a healthy lifestyle. But you don't understand what the lifestyle is anyway. The conditions that most people are forced to live in many of these territories. And if you don't understand the history that leads to where we are today, then you can't even fathom this thing. Yeah, it's easy to say, well, the girl who just turned up missing, this Not Afraid. Selena Not Afraid. Oh, well, she probably died of hypothermia exposure just because she was left behind, from a party. So, and they say, well, no foul play suspected. Well, what are the conditions that could even lead to that circumstance, where somebody could be left to freeze to death? And I'm not, even if you're not going to call it foul play, what are the living standards? Look, we have people freeze to death in some of those territories in the Dakotas. Every year, we're gonna hear about somebody who froze to death, not because they got left behind in a car, from a broken down car, because in spite of all the minerals and the gas and the oil that's being stripped out of some of these native territories, there are people who living in mobile homes with no heat. Every year we hear these stories. Dying of exposure, freezing to death right in your own home, or burning to death in a home that you had no way to heat, so you have some sort of unsafe, perhaps a wood stove or kerosene heater or some damn thing because the living conditions are so rough. And we see that. I mean, you don't have to go out west to see that. I've seen that in native territories here in what people consider New York State, Oneida, Mohawk territory, Seneca territory. No, we see these conditions happen all the time. So this is an ancient history that I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the history that brings us to where we are today. Now, don't get me wrong. By and large, you can look at our people and say, man, you people are survivors, considering all you've gone through. And we are. But there are casualties of that survival every year. Many of those casualties are our young people and our women. Many of the casualties of this struggle for survival don't survive. So, I mean, you can look at our numbers and you say, well, your population's on the increase. But that doesn't mean we're not losing people along the way. Again, we lead in death by cop. We lead in prison population. We lead in suicides. Before there was even a measure of youth suicides, because that wasn't even measured, in the United States. The idea of somebody 12-year-old committing suicide was such an anomaly, they didn't even keep track of it. But if you look through, and Jake and I were talking after the show our last show, there's pretty good evidence based on tracking where these missing and murdered Indigenous women come from, the areas, the pockets of these missing and murdered Indigenous women, that it isn't just a cultural condition that allows our women to be made missing or murdered. There may be actual serial killers. I mean, and yet for all of the, Criminal Minds shows and the SVUs and all the stuff that you see on television, nobody's giving Nobody's giving special attention to the numbers and these, these cells. They call them cancer cells when you get a rash of people who die in a specific area. Murder. Oh, there you go. Yeah. In fact, they used to call them cancer clusters. Same thing. Murder clusters. There are murder clusters specifically tied to Native people that never get investigated. There's no special crimes unit. They don't send out their FBI profilers out there to find out why do we have this rash why do we have a murder cluster, death clusters of our women? Why? Because we're such a low priority. And the reality is, while there may very well be, and there's plenty of evidence suggesting there's mass murderers, serial killers who are not even being investigated. They're going to find some of them are cops. But the other thing is the conditions that our people live in make these opportunities almost too much for the rape culture that is the United States and Canada to not fill that, to not take the opportunity. The conditions support and enable these things to happen. So when we talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women, I think it's really important to think that people go well beyond. Yes, I think there are cultural conditions, and when I say culture, I don't mean our culture. I mean the American, the rape culture, the patriarchy, the misogyny. These are all parts. The racism. These parts of the American DNA are what leads to much of this. And so that culture may be creating these conditions. But even beyond that culture, if anybody cared to look, if anybody gave a damn, they might find out that there are men who may have a laundry list of Native women that they've killed. There are certain pockets within certain regions of both the U.S. and Canada that are where there's far too many Native people, women in particular, who turned up dead, to suggest that it's a cultural thing. No, it is a cultural thing, but it also may be represented by a serial killer or two or three or five. When you look at the Osage murders from the 1920s, the FBI wanted to reduce it down to a serial killer. They didn't want to acknowledge that there was a cultural thing. The opposite thing almost exists here. Everybody knows that the missing and murdered Indigenous women issue is a cultural thing. They know that the policies of the U.S. have created these conditions. And the racism and misogyny of white men in particular. 70% of domestic violence that Native women experience happen at the hands of white people who almost get a free pass. It's almost legal. What do you mean it's almost legal? If there's no law enforcement, and if white men can't be prosecuted by Native police, if you have no enforcement, then how do you say it's illegal on paper, but in practice it's okay? Look, we have seen these conditions, every step of our lives as we've interacted with Native people. I mean, part of what led to even AIM coming into existence had to do with some of the racist activities that Native people experienced. And the beauty of all this stuff is how convenient people can denigrate Native people and then tie us to alcohol issues, not even recognizing that the alcoholism was also something that was done to our people. Now, I'm not saying that our people aren't willingly self-medicating today, but alcohol was used as a tool for submission. Alcohol was literally requisitioned for treaty negotiations. Getting Native people liquored up was a government policy Terrorism was a government policy right back to George Washington. That's why we call him Run the Gaius and every other president since then. By the way, that's one of our T-shirts. Run the Gaius, George Washington with blood on his hands and his apron. Look, this is the real history, folks. And I don't mean to make light of it, but I want to shine a light on it. I get, my grandkids really, they're oftentimes they'll say to the teacher, my grandfather, knows how to speak about Native issues. Most of those teachers are scared to death to have me. They don't understand that I can do an age appropriate, conversation with kids. My grandson's asking me today, to come to a school, and I will, and I will go. But the first thing I gotta get a teacher who's got enough courage to let somebody come in, and of course, in a perfect world, what they would consider a perfect world, I would screen every comment that I'm going to make with them first. But that's probably not going to happen. And look, I could talk about what a 49er is. That's pop culture right there, right? Let's talk about what a San Francisco 49er is. Let's talk about the truth of what mascot issue is. And there are ways of addressing this even with kids so they understand the inappropriateness of it. And you know what? We should do this not just for Native kids. We certainly should do it for Native kids. Our own kids should be empowered about what true history is. No, it wasn't John Wesley Powell who first explored the Grand Canyon. And the fact that your textbook says it is just another example of the lies they put into those textbooks. No, we should credit Native people for the cultural advancements. And when I say cultural advancements, I'm not talking about civilization defined by white men. I mean cultural advancement in the humanities, the understanding of our humanness, and the relationship that our human form has with the rest of creation. That's a higher level of thinking. And look, we can get into, some people will call that spirituality. I don't. I talk about our advancement in the area of humanities as an evolution of thought, an acknowledgement, an enlightenment about our place in the world, and not as a spiritual thing, but as a pragmatic, a common sense understanding that we have a role to play, not in just fixing, nature, but in finding our place within nature. In fact, the idea that we think we can dam a river without consequences, or we can block out the sun with smoke billowing out of refineries, or we can belch a bunch of methane into the air, or we can do all of these things and have no consequences. That's not a Native concept. We have a story, and I've mentioned this many times, but I'll mention it again, where we talk about our grandfathers, and I want to explain this because I know there are different interpretations, and some people who I've heard tell the story, I don't necessarily agree with their interpretation. We talk about our grandfathers having put the dinosaurs down to make our time. Now, for me, I know that when I think of our grandfathers, I think about our grandfathers meaning the elements. When we talk about the four directions, we call the four directions our grandfathers. The winds, the weather, the conditions, whatever. And we talk about the stars being our distant relatives. So whatever it is that caused the demise of the dinosaurs and made them extinct, they were the natural forces that we associate as our ancient relatives. We talk about those being our relatives. And we don't literally mean them to be our relatives, but we talk about our grandfathers having put down the dinosaurs to make for our time. And we warn, there's almost a warning in that story, that those things that have been put down and into Mother Earth. So our time to live on our mother, off our mother, would be made. And not just mean our time, but the time of all of creation, everything that we see that lives today. Much of that would not be possible if the earth hadn't gone through some of its changes. Look, we have there's almost no animal that preys specifically. We're not in the food chain. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm not saying that we're at the top of the food chain. We're near the top because we'll kill and eat anything. But we're not on anybody's real predator list. Not now, not anymore. But when we dig into our mother, when we dig into the planet to pull out fossil fuels, that's like giving life to the dinosaurs again. The very thing that we are warned about. These are parts of our stories. Now, look, I know some people will try to make these into spiritual stories or what are the prophecies? No, these aren't prophecies or it's not even a spiritual thing. These are pragmatic warnings. You know, there's so much that gets lost in history and in translation. You know, another thing that I talk about a lot of times, we used to, when we would talk about making a treaty, not just with white men, but even amongst other native peoples or other peoples, we talked that this will be the way as long as the waters flow and the grass grows and the sun shines, the wind blows. We use these kinds of things that are perpetual. But people, when we hear water flow, they think people start saying, well, as long as the rivers flow. In fact, I even heard people say, as long as the rivers flow downhill. What other direction are they going to flow? I don't know. That doesn't even make sense. But that's not where that water flow is. Also the flow of water with birth. I mean, the most personal water that flows from man is that water that what do you say when somebody's going to give birth? Their water broke. The water flow, because our children, it's not a coincidence that our creation story talks about living, life and the role that water plays. Our first environment before we come out of the womb is submerged in water. So when we say as long as the water flows, we mean as long as we perpetuate life. Literally, not just water is life. I mean, and look, that's not just a metaphor or a euphemism. Water is our first environment. We are born of water. But that gets lost. I mean, it isn't just that a river is sacred, or that a lake is sacred, or that a pond or an ocean is sacred. So this idea of sacredness. And that's why I say we kind of break the rules here. We don't confine ourselves to that. We know how much of our existence is tied to water. Not just because we have a cool stream that goes by. So anyway, the show, the purpose of the show was to give a couple of examples how history is rewritten, how it's lied about, how it's misrepresented. In pop culture, 49ers playing the Chiefs in the Super Bowl. Jeopardy questions. I mean, and in our history books. Not our history books. The history books that our kids are being taught from. I said it before, actually before the school year started. We have a responsibility to correct what our kids are being taught. So, let's step up. All right, folks, this is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. We'll be back here on Tuesday. Thanks for listening. We'll see you then. Yahweh.